This begins CD number 3.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Wa sallallahu ala Sayyidina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa sallam taslima. Wa la hawla wa la quwwata illa billah al-ali al-azim. Before I go into just the brief overview of those attributes that are known as the sifat as-salbiya, or the negating attributes, because they negate things about God that are considered inconceivable, and I prefer that word to impossible in terms of the subject matter of this science is what is wajib lillah, which is necessary or a necessity in our understanding. What is wajib lillah, what is jaiz lillah, which is sometimes translated as possible, but I think a better word is conceivable, and what is mustahil, which is translated as impossible, but I think better inconceivable, because the way that it's explained is ma la yutasawwaru fil aqli khilafuhu, what the intellect cannot conceive of. So, seen in some of the books in English, this is impossible for God, and I just felt that word does not sound right, because huwa qadirun ala kulli shay, He has power over all things. And impossible literally in English means not without passe, without power. So I think it's better to say inconceivable about God. So in terms of the negating attributes, this in Christian theology, Catholic theology, they called it the via negativa, which is negating path to understanding God. And the idea behind this is that we, in a sense, cannot know what God is more than we can know what God isn't. And the reason for that, when we speak of God, we are speaking of the infinite creator of the heavens and the earth. And just the fact that we understand that God is infinite, the word infinite means without limit. Imam al-Tahawi says, La hududa. God has no had. Now the word in Arabic for definition is the same word that we use, is had. Like in Arabic, when they tell you what a word means, they say hadduhu. It's definition, because a definition is what defines or gives finiteness to a concept. It limits it, it demarcates it, it puts it in a perspective. So when we talk about God, we cannot define God, because to define God would to give God a had, a limit. And for that reason, it's better to understand what God is not. And that is why the ulama say all of Aqeedah can be reduced to two statements. Laysa kamithlihi shay, He's not like anything. وَلَا لَا يُشْبِهُ لَا تُشْبِهُ ذَاتُهُ الذَّوَاتِ, that His essence is not like any other essence. وَلَا مُتَعَتِّرَ لِلصِّفَاتِ, and His attributes are not in any way metaphorical, or in other words, without real import or meaning. Because metaphor, when it breaks down, and that has to do with the Mu'tazilite who denied certain attributes of Allah. They said that God was qadir, but He didn't have qudra. So they negated qudra, power for Allah, even though they said Allah was all-powerful. And that's a semantic problem that now is really a waste of time to even go in, because it's not a problem for us. But this idea of not having a definition for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in that way. And that's why all of our definitions about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala are in fact things that negate. So if we say, they say the definition in the books of Aqeedah of Allah is Al-Ghaniyu an al-Jami' wal-Jami'u muftaqirun ilay. He has no need of anyone, and everyone is in need of Him. And so if you look at that, essentially what it is, again, is it's negating. It negates for Allah need, and it negates for us independence. So all of our real essential understandings about our Lord are negating. They are negating. Now, here's where we get into another central problem to religion, and that is the problem of transcendence and immanence. Transcendence is when we speak about God without anything in the world that can guide us to God. There's nothing in the world that we can say that is God. Ta'ala Allah amma yasifun. Allah is above and beyond anything they ascribe to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So when we speak about transcendence, we're speaking about the above and the beyondness, subhanaka, which is called tanzih in Arabic. Tanzih means transcendence. The other problem, and pure transcendence has a lot of problems. It becomes the God of the scientists. Like Einstein believed in God, but he did not believe in a personal God. He believed in a transcendent God. The God he believed in was the God of the deists, who has nothing to do with his creation. And that's a problem. The other problem is what's called tashbih, or immanence. The idea of God being in the world. And this, obviously, in the Hindu tradition, because Hindus, a lot of people don't know, the Hindus are actually, the Brahmin class don't really believe in idols. But it's kind of a little trick to help all the stupid people out there that need to still evolve. Literally, I mean, there's an understanding in their tradition that lower classes or caste systems, what they call the varna, if you're in a lesser varna, you can't understand the Brahma because he's gone through several lifetimes to get to the ability to perceive what he can perceive. And he understands the Godhead, what they call the Brahma. He understands the God that has no attribute, and they call that the Nirguna. And then they have this idea, but people need to see something. And so they give them all these idols that they really know are not God, but it helps the common people understand. Well, this is the transcendent, immanent problem in religion. The way that Christianity deals with that, obviously, is through Jesus, because Jesus becomes the incarnation of God. God enters into the flesh. And this is what we call in our tradition ittihad or hulul, where God comes in. And some of the deviant Sufis claimed this state. I mean, this is what Ibn Mashish in his famous prayer says, وَانْشِلْنِي مِنْ أَوْحَادَ التَّوْحِيدِ. Save me from the dangers of Tawheed. And one of the dangers of Tawheed is losing sight of creation, of diversity, and denying truths. So within that tradition, the immanence within our tradition, how do we understand the immanence of God? In other words, what is the tashbih in relation to tanzih and tashbih? Because you have to have access to your Lord. If you have a transcendent God, it becomes a cold, distant, uncaring, unloving God. On the other hand, if you give God attributes of creation, you have a whole other problem. And that's what we call anthropomorphism, and falling into the idea that God is petulant, that God has emotions, that God has anger, that He has pleasure in any anthropomorphic terms. And this is a problem within some of the Muslim understandings. There are Muslims that think that when these words are used in hadith or in the Quran, فَبَأُوا بِغَضْبٍ مِّنَ اللَّهِ, they return with the ghadab of Allah, or maghdubi alayhim. They think somehow that this anger is like our anger, that God becomes angry in an emotional sense, and that ta'ala Allah amma yasifun. Above and beyond Allah is Allah from anything they ascribe to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But we do believe that ghadab has a meaning. We believe that rida has a meaning. We believe that these words that Allah uses in the Quran, radiyallahu anhum wa radu anhu. They were pleased with Allah and Allah was pleased with them. But don't think that your pleasure with Allah is Allah's pleasure with you. Don't think that those two words mean the same thing in the context that they're being used. Each means a specific thing in relation to that thing that it is predicating. So when we talk about the attributes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, we have to be extremely careful, because we in a sense can only say about Allah what Allah has said about Himself. And then we enter into another problem, which is the interpretive problem. Because even though Allah is telling us things about Himself, He's self-disclosing to us, He is self-disclosing through language. And language is filtered through the human mind. And the human mind has the capacity to interpret what is being said to it in many, many different ways. And so the Prophet ﷺ is the purest filter. He is still a filter. The Prophet ﷺ is a human filter, but he is the purest filter, and that's why the prophets have a capacity that other human beings do not have. And that is that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has chosen them to be these filters for revelation. And that is why the best understanding of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the understanding that the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam articulates to us. And that's why he said, Allahumma la nuhsina thana'a alayka anta kama athnayta ala nafsika. We're not able to praise you. You are as you praised yourself. In other words, I cannot truly praise you, because praise, one of the reasons that we praise is because of our knowledge of the praiseworthy. If you don't know the qualities of someone, you can't really praise them. And that's why in Allah's self-disclosure to us, He is giving us the reasons why He is the praiseworthy, Al-Hamid, because He's told us attributes that He has. And so understanding these attributes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala enables us to know Allah. Now those attributes are known through human experience. And this is where you get into the tashbih, that there has to be some correlation between what we understand about Allah and what we understand about ourselves, or what's in the world, or we could not know Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It's not possible. And so in dealing with the negating attributes, you're still working with things in the world. So when we say Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is qadim, and qadim is a problematic word in that it is a technical word. It's not found in the Quran. It's not a name of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It was used as a technical term. Qidam is the attribute, and this is a salbi attribute because it negates hadath. It negates occurrence. It negates the fact that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala hadatha, He came into existence. No. The idea of qidam is that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is as He was and will always be, without any time factor. And this is where pre-eternity is the best we can do in English. And I've racked my mind for a better word. Old in Old English is very similar to qidam, and was an attribute of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But we don't really have, when we say pre-eternity, I don't even know what that means. And that's why when I tell you, well, Allah has pre-eternity, that's an attribute, I don't know what that means. I really don't. It's a word that is the best that we have come up with as a way of describing al-awwaliyya bila ibtida, firstness without beginning. So Allah was before everything. But that was before everything, we're in language. And language is problematic when you speak about what is beyond comprehension. And that's why the word aliha in Arabic means to bewilder. The root word for God in Arabic means to bewilder. And the wallaha, is when somebody falls madly in love and becomes a complete blithering idiot. He is in a state of wala. The Arabs knew that they had that understanding, that when we are speaking about Allah, we're entering into the realm of hayra, which is a type of ha'irun fima huwa ha'irun. Like one of the poets said, وَالْمَرْءُ فِي الْمِحْنَةِ عَيْ. A man is bewildered in his fima huwa ha'irun. Ha'ir also means sa'ir, to be what he's doing or what he's... That we're in a state of this bewilderment, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has revealed Himself in the Quran with these attributes. That is one revelation. The other revelation is the world itself. Revelation in our understanding are two. The ayats in ourselves and on the horizon, and the ayats in the Quran. The ayat in the Quran tell us that وَهُوَ عَلَى كُلِّ شَيْءٍ قَدِيرٌ حَيٌّ لَا يَمُوتُ يُحْيِي وَيُمِيتُ الْمُحْيِي وَالْمُمِيتُ. He's al-Wajid, He's al-Qawi al-Mateen, Dhul Quwwat al-Mateen, al-Razzaq, Qahirun fawqa ibadihi. He gives us all these attributes in the Quran in which He tells us about Himself, and we relate those attributes to what we know in the world. When you say Qahir, you have to have some understanding of Qahar, of what it means to overpower something. Right? You have to have some understanding of that. Somebody was fleeing from Egypt and asking for asylum in the U.S. The translator at the State Department, the letter said, أنا مضطر أن أخرج من تحت ظروف قاهرة. I have to leave under excruciating circumstances. Qahira means overwhelming, overpowering. But the interpreter said, I have to leave in an envelope made in Cairo. So you have to understand language in order for it to be meaningful. Because if you don't know what the words mean, you cannot understand what's being said to you. Now how, when Allah tells us He's qahirun fawqa ibadihi, you have to know what qahirun is, you have to know what fawq is, you have to know what ibad is, and you have to know what a damir, a pronoun, a referent that goes back to something else. You have to know what that is as well. And that's in any analytical statement. You have to be able to determine the terms that are being used and define them, and that enables you to understand the statement. Because if you don't know Arabic and I say, Allah is qahirun fawqa ibadihi, you don't know what that means. But if you're an Arab, you know what qahir means, you know what fawq means. Al-kitab fawqa tawila, the book is on top of the table. Now, is that literal? Because this is the prepositions. We're dealing with on, and what does that mean? Because when you say He's qahirun fawqa ibadihi, on means on top of. Ibad means His servants, His abid, His slaves. Is He qahirun fawqa ibadihi? Literally, we can't say that, no. This is a metaphorical usage of the word. When I say that Al-Ustad qahirun fawqa qudrati, my teacher, he's overwhelmed. I can't do anything. Fawqa qudrati. I'm not saying he's literally on top of me or over me. I'm using it figuratively. And this is the problem with language, of determining exactly what's being said to us. So this interpretive faculty that human beings have, which is very profound, is also very dangerous because things can be so easily misinterpreted. So when we speak about these attributes, we have to understand we're in the realm of language, and language it limits us. Because language by its nature is definitions. It is defining, it's limiting, and you cannot limit Allah. So when we speak with language, and that's why one of the Persian poets has a beautiful poem just about how he was listening to this theologian, and he just thought he sounded so ridiculous when he was talking about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, because it's like somebody who is madly in love and he hears somebody describing his beloved who's not in love with the beloved. You cannot describe to me what has intoxicated me. It just doesn't work. So if we look at qidam, that is what qidam means. It means that Allah was and nothing was with Him. This enters into the idea of time and the createdness of time. Muslims believe that time is created. And this is where the atomic theory comes in, because the Muslims actually, al-Baqallani, actually believe that time was made up, that it was substantial. So he actually, in what we now call the time-space continuum, this idea of time and space being inextricably bound together, which is a very modern concept. This was also the understanding of Abu Bakr al-Baqallani, that you couldn't separate time from substance, and that's why, because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is not a substance in that way. And this is one of the big problems in Christianity, of the idea of ousia, what they call in Greek ousia, which is substance, which was one of the 10 categories in logic, whether or not we could describe Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala as that. And Al-Bukhari has a chapter in the Quran, the permissibility of using the word thing, shay, to describe Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But that permissibility is not that Allah is a thing, but that it is permissible to use it, because you cannot say He's not a thing, because if you say Allahu la shay'a, you see, if you say God is no thing, then you're negating His existence. But if you say He's shay, you also have a problem, because shay is the masdar of sha'a yasha'u shay'an. Shay is the thing that's willed into existence. And Allah He is the sha'i, He is the one that creates and wills into existence. So that use of Allah, of shay with Allah, is taken from the Quran, that it is permissible, but with that understanding, that it is to avoid the danger of saying that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is not a thing. But we do not understand Allah, laysa kamithlihi shay'un. There is no shay that is like Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And so when we say He existed before time, even before time is problematic because before is an adverb of time. And so when you say that Allah existed before time, you're using an adverb of time to describe something that has nothing to do with time. And that is why it's just a dead-end road and you will become perplexed. So the best thing to understand is, one, that we are in time, that God did not, this is one of the things that people who write books about why God doesn't exist will say things like that. Why didn't He create, the universe was created 15 billion years ago. Why didn't He do it 20 billion years ago? Or 50 billion years ago? And that type of reasoning is inconceivable for us. We would say that yastahilu. That is not conceivable, that time is Allah's creation, and it's part of the secret of existence. And we know that to prove that the ancients understood this, the ancients differentiate between, in our language, English, between eternal and everlasting. Eternal is outside of time. Everlasting is in time. And so we would say the soul is everlasting, whereas God is eternal. And those are very different concepts. But obviously the first one we don't, because even infinity is a very problematic understanding. Now, so qidam is that. And then baqa is the next negating attribute. Al-baqi. كُلُّ مَا عَلَيْهَا فَانٍ وَيَبْقَى وَجْهُ رَبِّكَ ذُو الْجَلَالِ وَالْإِكْرَامِ. Everything is in a state of annihilation, fan. It is going into annihilation. And Allah, yabqa. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, yabqa. And obviously, these type of verses are verses that, for people that take these things completely literally, that's a good example of why you can't take things literally, because it says, yabqa wajhu rabbika. The wajh is what remains in that ayah. So if you're trying to say that Allah, there's other parts to Allah that don't go on or something like that, it's insane. And that's why we negate, but that's the last attribute of the unity of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, His wahda or wahdaniyah. So baqa is sempiternity, that it is the eternal quality of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Now, when we say qidam, we're looking one way, which the Arabs call azal. And then the other way is called abad. The Arabs actually have two words. One goes backward to the azal, kana mawjudan fil azal. It's looking in the past. And then abad is looking in the future. Now, the interesting thing about the Arabs have another word which is called dahar. And dahar is the continuum, and this is in Fairuz Abadi's dictionary, in Al-Muhit. Dahar is the continuum of azal and abad. So dahar is time-space. Now there is a hadith in which says, لا تسب الدهر فإنني أنا الدهر. Do not curse time because I am time. But that word dahar, Allah didn't use zaman, He used dahar. But then it's explained, بيدي الليل والنهار. I possess time, and therefore I am time. Allah is not literally time, but time is in the hand of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And this gets to the transcendent immanent issue as well, because one of the problems of that is obviously pantheism, which is people who think that all of this is Allah, that this is God, the universe. And then you have panentheism, which was the reason why Ibn Taymiyyah negated the idea of God being infinite and said that He had limits, but they were known only to Himself, because he had the problem of panentheism. When you said la hudud, if you said God has no limits, in his mind he thought that that would lead to people thinking that He permeated His creation. And this is where you get into contingent and necessary existence, which is a problem also. The idea of what is this? Where did it come from? How is it existing? And we say it exists in the knowledge of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It is contingent upon Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's existence. هُوَ مَوْجُودٌ فِي عِلْمِ اللَّهِ. In the knowledge of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, Allah has the highest analogies. We can use an analogy of a unicorn, which philosophers for some reason love the idea of unicorns, because unicorns are imaginary creatures. And the philosophical question is, do they exist? The fact that we've imagined them, do they have an existence? Because they definitely exist in a mind. Because if I say unicorn, and if you know the English language well enough, you have an image of a horse that has a horn. Well, we don't find it in nature, but we have an image of it. So where does that exist? Does it have substantial existence? No, it has contingent existence. Its existence is contingent upon my thought. And if I remove it from my thought, it no longer exists. And we believe this about the creation itself, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's creation is contingent upon His qayyumiyyah, His sustaining reality. And if Allah removes His qayyumiyyah from existence, existence disappears. So we're not like Hindus. We don't say that existence doesn't exist, that it's maya, that it's like an illusion. We don't believe that. But it is dreamlike in that way that its existence is contingent, and it's also, once you die, this will seem like a complete dream to you in relation to the next world. And that's why people feel like they woke up from a deep sleep. I mean, that's literally the experience that we're told in the Quran and in the Hadith. And the athar of Imam Ali, which is strong, is الناس نيام فإذا ماتوا انتبهوا. People are asleep, and when they die, he didn't say استيقظوا. They wake up. He said intabahu. And that's because it's intabah means to come to attention. So it's like you're daydreaming. So life is like a daydream. You're not really asleep. It's not a complete dream, but you're not fully awake. And when people die, they come to this full awakening. And that's why the akhirah is described as al-hayawan, the true life, as opposed to this world. And so that is the idea of baqa. I mean, I really feel so inadequate talking about these things. And as I get older, it feels more absurd almost. Language just limits us, and that's why some of our greatest, like Imam al-Ghazali, he got to the point where it was difficult for him to even talk because of his realization about what he was speaking about. We're doing such a grave injustice. And the Prophet, he heard the Jewish man came and he told him about God wrapping up all the cosmos in His hands. And the Prophet laughed when he said it. And he said, مَا قَدْرُ اللَّهَ حَقَّ قَدْرِهِ. They haven't understood Allah. They have not given Allah any true estimation of Allah. And that's somehow, to me, that is whatever we say about Allah other than what Allah has said about Himself. I really feel that we almost have to laugh. That the Prophet ﷺ, the fact that it's a sunnah to see as humorous how inadequate our words are in describing Allah is very refreshing for me. I feel very comforted by that. The next quality is mukharifun li nafsihi, bila mithal. Mukharifun is incomparability or dissimilarity. And again, this is the problem of tanzih and tashbih, that while we have an understanding that Allah is absolutely dissimilar, we also have to use similarities to speak about Allah. If I say Allah is a sami', He is the all-hearing, you have to have some concept of what hearing is in order for you to understand in any way what I'm talking about. And the only way you know about what hearing is because you can hear. You know what ears are. You know what sound is. And yet our understanding is that Allah yasma'u bila jariha, that Allah, there's no means by which Allah hears. That Allah does not, sound waves do not reach Him in that way. He is the creator of sound waves. He does not need sound waves to hear. He does not need an 8th cranial nerve to hear. God is ta'ala Allah amma yasifun. He has no need of this organ of hearing that we have and this hess that we have. So when we speak about Allah, we have to recognize that when we say He's mukharifun li khalqihi, He's incomparable, it means in reality. So while we have to compare when we speak about Allah to things we know, we have to also retain in our understanding that laysa kamithlihi shay'. And that's why that ayah is so perfect, because it says laysa kamithlihi shay' wa huwa sami' al-basir. Nothing is like Him. And then He tells us, and He can hear, just to really send it home to us. Nothing is like Him. And having said that, by the way, I can hear and I can see. But don't think that hearing and sight is anything to do with your hearing and sight. And that's what we have to keep in mind when we say مُخَالِفٌ لِخَلْقِهِ. Right? That's what we have to keep in mind. That we do need the mushabaha, but we have to understand the mushabaha. And I know this is kind of a debatable mathematical understanding, but the way that I like to understand this is there's a concept, an Indian mathematician, that put forward the idea that any number over infinity is zero. And that is how I like to look at this, is that any quality that Allah describes Himself with that has any similarity to creation, when we recognize that His is infinite and ours is finite, it cancels out ours. In other words, there is no comparability. We cannot compare our hearing to Allah's hearing. We can't compare our knowledge to Allah's knowledge, because our knowledge is ignorance. Like Ibn Atta'illah said, Ilahi ana jahilun fi ilmi, fakayfa la akunu jahilan fi jahli. Oh my God, I am ignorant in what I know. So how could I not be ignorant in what I'm ignorant of? And that's a deep knowledge. Ana jahilun fi ilmi. I am ignorant in my knowledge. In other words, in relation to your knowledge, I am jahil. I know nothing. I know nothing. And so that is, I think, a good way to look at that. مُخَالِفٌ لِخَلْقِهِ is that those things that Allah has given us in order to approximate some kind of understanding of our Lord, those things in reality have nothing to do with our Lord. The next one is قَائِمٌ بِنَفْسِهِ. قَائِمٌ بِنَفْسِهِ, in classical Western theology, they called it aseity, which is self-sufficiency. It is the idea that it's esse, of the essence. It doesn't need anything to exist. And this is where we get into contingent and necessary existence. When we speak about human beings, we're speaking about contingent creatures. I cannot exist without space. And if I move from here to here, at each step that I went, I filled space. At each step. I need this space. When I move back here, there's an empty, it's filled with oxygen, but because gas is dense, I can move and actually the gas dissipates for me to be in that place. So when I move back here, I have space again. Now, if I was in cement, I couldn't move because the cement is more dense, right, or of equal density to me, and so I can't move. And that space, but I still need that space, not for long if I was in cement, but I still need it, right? I need that space. Now, obviously, when I die, because the body's constituents, you can't create or destroy energy, right? Energy is everything that exists. It will just transfer into something else. So everything in the world, we're in this enclosed system. And everything just moves to something else. And that's one of the proofs, according to the ulama, of the existence of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, is the corruptibility of the world. The fact that it is changing. So I'm contingent being. I cannot exist by myself. I have to have space to exist in. I have to have air to breathe. I'm contingent. One of the beautiful statements, Imam Ali radiallahu anhu was asked once about the qadr. And he said, are human beings, do they have free will or do they have absolute determination? Right? Are they determined creatures? And he said, lift up your right leg. And the man lifted up his right leg and he said, now, without putting down your right leg, lift up your left leg. And he said, I can't. And he said, you're between that state. In other words, there's certain things you can do, but there's things you can't do. And so human beings, Allah has limited us in order to emphasize our ubudiyah, our iftiqar. There's a poet who said, an Arabic poet who said that, oh Allah, I'm at your door with nothing to give you but my impoverishment. That's the only gift that I have to give you, is that I have nothing to give you. And that state that Allah has put us in, a contingent being, is to in order that we come to know who we are. And by knowing who we are, we then know by the negation of those things for Allah, we know who Allah is. So if I am hadith, I'm not qadim. By knowing that I'm hadith, I can understand something about Allah, because Allah is not hadith. So what I affirm for myself, I end up negating for Allah. By knowing that I am fani, I know Allah is baqi. By knowing that I am ushabihul khalq, I am like creation. I had an exercise once that I had to do in creative thinking, was to describe all of the things that were similar between a frog and a spaceship. And I came up with so many things, and a lot more than other people could do in that exercise. And the only reason was because I was trained in Islamic theology. And I understood. There's a lot of people that got that and they just couldn't think of anything that a frog had in common with a ship. And there were plenty of things, right? 3-dimensional, in time space, created to move from one place to another, able to leap tall buildings with a single bound. So, by knowing these qualities that I have as a human being, I understand that these are the things I have to negate for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And also self-sufficiency. And I want to just show you something really interesting here. I think it's interesting. This is a book called Jewish Theology. It was used at the Hebrew Union College in Boston, printed 1918 by Dr. K. Kohler. He was a rabbi and a professor of theology. And he has a chapter on Mohammedanism. Now this, I just really like this. Listen to this. He says here that the Mohammedan religion is an agency of divine providence entrusted with the historical mission of cooperating in the building up of the Messianic kingdom, thus preparing for the ultimate triumph of pure monotheism in the hearts and lives of all men and nations of the world. These views, voiced by Yehuda HaLevi, Maimonides, and Nehemidides, were reiterated by many enlightened rabbis of later times. These point out that both the Christian and Mohammedan nations believe in the same God and His revelation to man, in the unity of the human race, and in the future life. That they have spread the knowledge of God by sacred literature based upon our scripture. That they have retained the divine commandments essentially as they are phrased in our Decalogue, and have practically taught men to fulfill the Noahidic laws of humanity. There are 7 Noahidic laws. There are the laws of Noah, and that the Jews believe that a non-Jew has an easier time. That's why they discourage conversion. In fact, a rabbi is supposed to refuse conversion to you 7 times. And it's not because they actually feel you're safer as a Noahide in salvation than you are as a Jew. That it's harder to be a Jew. I mean, this is traditional, real Jewish theology. Because they have 613 laws that they have to follow. So Noahides only have 7. Now here's the real important point here. On account of the last fact, the medieval Jewish authorities considered Christians to be half proselytes, while the Mohammedans, being pure monotheists, were always still closer to Judaism. In other words, they traditionally considered us to be closer to the true understanding than the Christians because of the problem of the Trinity. Now the Trinity, to be fair to the Christians, and I think this is important because there are a lot of Muslims that think that Christians are mushrikun, and there are statements. I mean, Ibn Umar radiallahu anhu said that I can't imagine anything more associative than to say that Allah had a son. And that's a statement by Ibn Umar. But it's not possible that Allah would permit Muslims to marry Jews and Christians if they were considered to be mushrik, because we know at mushrikun najis that there's a najasa ma'nawiyah, and the fact that you can love and have conjugal relation and those things. And this is where you get into ta'alaw ila kalimatin sawa'in baynana wa baynakum. Come to a word that we share together. Allah na'budu illa Allah. That we only worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. وَلَا نَتَّخِذَ بَعْضَنَا أَرْبَابًا مِن دُونِ اللَّهِ. That we, بَعْضُنَا بَعْضًا أَرْبَابًا مِن دُونِ اللَّهِ. That we should not, some of us should not take others as arbab. Now I want to stress the point, because if you look in the commentary, when Adi ibn Hatim came to the Prophet, and he was a Najranite Christian, he came and he said, Ya Rasulullah, we didn't take each other as lords beside God. And he said, did you make halal what they said was halal and haram what they said haram? And he said, yes. And he said, then you took them as lords beside Allah, because we believe a tashri' is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's alone. And that's a tashri' al-mutlaq. I mean, that doesn't mean like living traffic laws. I mean, that's not what the Prophet ﷺ was talking about. He was talking about laws related to God and religion. That if a Jew or a Christian rabbi says this is halal or this is haram, and you believe it from that point of view. So the Prophet negated that. And the Christians, they do have an understanding of monotheism. And if you get into Catholic doctrine, the Catholics do not believe in anthropomorphism. They actually negate it, and they believe that Allah is infinite and has pure, is a simple substance, which is unity. And this gets into composite or compound, which is one of the things we negate. La a'da. Imam al-Tahawi says that Allah is not compounded of parts. And they believe the same thing about God. But their problem is the incarnation, and they term that a mystery. I mean, they do, and they talk about the personas of God and the oneness of the Godhead. And that's where, I mean, we definitely differ with them on that point. But it's important for us to recognize that we cannot fall into the same trinity of acts, attributes, and essence. And this is where when we talk about wahdaniyah, we're talking about the oneness of Allah in His acts, attributes, and essence. And even those three qualities, the that of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, which is mentioned in the hadith, the attributes are mentioned in the hadith, and the actions of Allah are obvious and mentioned in the Quran. فَعَالُ لِمَا يُرِيد. He does a fi'l that He wants. He does whatever act He wants. So the oneness of Allah is an understanding that whenever our understanding of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is that He does not direct His energy to any one place. So for instance, when we say in the Quran there are verses that indicate that He did certain things at certain times, that does not mean that other things were not in Allah's awareness and concern at that time. No, Allah has absolute knowledge of everything at every given time without any differentiation. Nothing occupies Him. لا يشغله شيء. Nothing occupies Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Nothing. Allah is absolutely one in everything that He manifests Himself to us. In His acts, attributes, and His essence remains hidden to us, but we believe that the essential nature of it is its existence, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala exists. And so, I mean, this is it's a difficult topic, but at the same time it's not. And so I'll just finish it by saying قُلْ هُوَ اللَّهُ أَحَدٌ. Say that Allah is ahad. And one of the things about the Arabs, that one is not a number. 2 is the first number in Arabic. So we don't consider 1 as an adad. And so قُلْ هُوَ اللَّهُ أَحَدٌ is a negation of adad and kathra. It negates number, that He's not 1, 2, or 3. He's not 2 or 3, He's 1. So that's a negation of adad, nafyu al-adad. And kathra is that He is not a composite. So Allah has no composite parts. Allah has no... we can't think of Him as having a face and a hands that are like our face and hands, that there's some kind of jariha, ears, eyes, mouth, those type things. All that stuff has to be dispelled from the mind. Laysa kamithlihi shay. Nothing is like Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And yet we affirm that He has described Himself with a wajh, with a yadain. We confirm those and we don't negate those, and we believe that, but we do not believe in any way that it has to do with anything like what we have. And that's why there's 2 interpretations, tafsili and ijmali. The later ulama went into detailed interpretation, which they were great scholars, and we don't consider them mubtadi'ah like some people do. But the preferred position has always been the early community's position of bila kayf that Imam Malik gave us. We don't go into details about any of this. We just believe in it, ala muradillah. Whatever Allah meant by it, we believe it and we don't negate it. So, Qul huwa Allahu ahad is negation of adad and kathra. Allahu samad is a negation of that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has any deficiency, any want, any need. So it's deficiency of naqs and qillah, that Allah is in want or that He's deficient. Allahu samad. These are the 8 kufriyat that are mentioned, and it's negated in Surah Al-Ikhlas. There's only 8 possible ways that you can misconceive Allah, and all of them are negated in Ikhlas, which is why it's a summation of 1/3 of the Quran, because 1/3 of the Quran is on the subject of Tawheed, and it is a perfect summation of it. Lam yalid wa lam yulad, al-illa wal-ma'luliyya, it negates cause and effect. So Allah has no sufficient cause, He has no formal cause, He has no material cause, and He certainly doesn't have what's called the illa al-gha'iyya, or the teleological cause. So we negate all of those causes for Allah. We also negate that anything lam yalid, that Allah does not produce anything that is independent of Him. I mean, this is really important. It doesn't just mean son. It negates the creation of an independent creation, which is what wilada is. Once a mother gives birth to the child is independent of the mother. Because the mother, she can die in childbirth and the child lives. So Allah, lam yalid, His creation, we're not deists. He didn't just create it and now it's separate and not in need of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So it negates that as well. So it's not just, He's not a parent, didn't give birth, nor was He born. No, it negates illa wal ma'luliyya. And then the last one, وَلَمْ يَكُنْ لَهُ كُفُوًا أَحَدٌ. There's nothing like Allah. He has no shabih and no nadhir. He has no likeness nor any opposite. أقول قولي هذا واستغفر الله.
In the few minutes we have, I'd just like to pose a couple of quick questions to the panelists. One of them, Dr. Omar, perhaps if you can address this. Actually, it's a 2-part question. Number one is, somebody writes, a Christian fundamentalist told me, or said, that someone made the claim the word Allah was the name of a pre-Islamic moon god. I think this may be referring to the Allat theory. And so could you address that? And the second part of the question is, could you also talk about the use of the male referent he and him in reference to God?
The first question about Allah referring to the moon god, Allah is the ancient Semitic deity, and the moon god I don't think was ever called Allah. The moon god was called Sin, and also by other names than that, by Sin, the letter Sin, I think. And there was a trinity in Yemen, which was the trinity of Venus, the sun, and the moon. And that became a Babylonian trinity, because the Babylonians had 2 trinities. And it's interesting that in the Quran, Abraham is first called upon to worship what? Venus. That's the Kawkab. And then the moon, and then the star. That is the ancient Babylonian trinity. But the moon god, who was very important for the Semites and for the Yemenis, who were the ancient Babylonians, they probably come from Yemen, I don't think it was ever called Allah. It's called Sin, and by other names to my knowledge. Allat is a feminization of Al-Ilaha. And that you find it in the grammarians, in the books of language, the dictionaries of the Muslims. Some of the great grammarians, they say that in the Semitic languages, well, they don't say it like that, they say in Arabic. But this would apply for the Semitic languages because they all come from the same root. They say that Allah and Ilah also were only singular, and that they did not have any other forms. They didn't have a plural form, and that the plural forms were introduced later on. Allat is one of them. It's a feminization. It was a feminine form of Allah. Allat is an ancient goddess. We find her in ancient Petra. We find her in the ancient Semitic tribes in the north. She's not just Arabian, but insofar as the use of the gender is concerned, one of the principles of Arabic language is, especially with regard to plurals, that the masculine gender includes all. And therefore it is sort of the gender without gender. Sometimes the feminine is used for emphasis and things of that nature. But Allah does not have gender. He is not he in the generic sense, nor is he she in the generic sense. In a lot of Muslim languages, that really didn't constitute a problem, such as Urdu or Persian, because of the fact that they don't have he and she. They don't have the he and she distinction, ou or vo. These are just he and she. And I think that that's very good, but in the Semitic languages, you have that distinction between he and she, and we use the masculine gender, but we don't believe that the Creator is masculine. And would you like to add to that, Imam Hamza?
Well, I know that in some of these unfortunate books, and they're really poorly written, like Sharush's book, Anis Sharush, the Palestinian, he's got a book, I think, Islam Unveiled. I've seen that repeated in several books. And one of the things that happens, in linguistics, there's a common, probably a lot of people have heard this before, there's 50 words for snow in the Inuit language. And that's actually in books on linguistics. You'll find that in a lot of research. And I actually read, there's a book called There's Only 3 Words for Snow in the Inuit language. And this guy, he was a linguist who went and researched it and found that there were only 3 words in all the dictionaries. And so he tried to find out where that came from. It turned out it was a remark that was made by somebody in some conference once, and it just entered into the literature and then was replicated. And this happens a lot in academic, it's not just on news and common things, it actually happens in academia as well, is that these mythologies end up entering in. And so you have to be vigilant about your research as well to know so that you can respond appropriately to these things. I mean, that's just a myth. That the Jahili Arabs understood Allah was that which, the sky god. It was the God without attributes. I mean, they had no conceptualization of Allah, and that is well known. There were no idols to Allah. In fact, they said we only worship the idols to draw us close to Allah. And then the other thing is that of the 3 aspects of Allah, the that, sifat, and af'al, 2 of them are feminine form. That and sifa are both feminine in the Arabic language, whereas fi'l is masculine. I mean, there's a whole cosmology behind that Andalusian, 13th century Andalusian scholar goes into about the passive and the active natures. That the essence is a passive aspect, and the attributes are passive, and it's the acts that are active, and that's why they're male. So, I mean, these are... alhamdulillah, I think that we have avoided any of that type of what now in feminist studies is termed patriarchal. Although we are, in a sense, we do have that aspect to Islam, but still our concept of God is certainly genderless, and that is well known and well documented. We have no concept of God the Father other than analogously, but we would say the mother analogously as well, because the Prophet used a mother to describe the mercy of God as an analogy in the Sahih Hadith. When he said, see this mother, do you think she'd throw her children into the fire? And they said no, and he said Allah's mercy is more than that mother. So he used the analogy of rahmah with a mother, because the highest understanding of rahmah that we as humans have in the world is the and we came from her womb, which is Rahim, which is where Rahmah comes from. So, I mean, the fact that the Prophet ﷺ used the mother as an analogy for an essential quality of our Lord is also important.
In the explanation of space and time and so forth, and the question about the universe, where does the theory of the Big Bang come into Islam, if anywhere? As far as the construction of the universe and the fact that Allah Ta'ala created the heavens and earth in 7 days, and the fact that time is relative and different from humans' point of view versus God's?
Well, the person to answer this question is Imam Hamza, and I think you'll like his answer very much.
Well, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim wa la hawla wa la quwwata illa billah. The first thing is that Imam al-Ghazali, somebody wrote him a letter and asked him, where is Allah? And he wrote a letter back telling him, you don't even know where you are. And I don't understand why you're asking me where God is. So in terms of our coordinates in the universe, we don't have a clue, because we don't even have a map of the universe. And so it's the height of arrogance to attempt to understand Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in any other than that we negate any likeness to the creation. Having said that, the time-space Big Bang idea, I mean, the Quran, I think, gives the most brilliant. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, مَا أَشْهَدْتُكُمْ خَلْقَ السَّمَاوَاتِ وَالْأَرْضِ. We didn't show you the creation of the heavens and earth. We didn't even show you your own creation. And that's, again, bringing it back home. You don't even know very much about yourself. I mean, most people don't know how it is they can drink something and then a few hours later they urinate it out. I mean, they don't even understand that process of what's happening. So the idea, I mean, the Big Bang is interesting, but it's still, the Big Bang is not ex nihilo, which is what we believe. The Big Bang does not say that this all came out of nothing. They don't know what existed at the moment of the Big Bang. I mean, they think it was all this condensed matter. It was a point, and a point is a very mysterious geometrical concept. Point is one of the most mysterious concepts we have. So they don't really know what it was, and that's what Allah says. You weren't there. You didn't see it. You didn't witness it. But we know that Allah said, kun fayakun, be and it is. And that's all. And like the Qawm say, nahnu bain al-kafi wa noon. We're between the kaf and the noon. Kun. Well, yeah, there's a whole correlation between the stages of the Big Bang. They do have 6 stages in it, which is similar to our understanding in the Quran of the 6 stages of creation. And that is the dominant theory. But I would like to say I am very wary of connecting anything in the Quran with scientific knowledge. And the reason is, one of the things that, I mean, Socrates had the last word on science. He said, how can you consider something knowledge that's always changing? Because the whole point of knowledge is either it's true and absolute or it's not. And the nature of science is that it is always changing. And if you don't believe that, you haven't studied the history of science, because people in pre-modern times believed in their cosmologies and their worldviews as strongly or more strongly than we believe in ours. They used to burn people at the stake if you didn't accept it. Here they'll just kick you out of the university. So they say, is there progress if you teach cannibals to eat with forks?
This completes CD number 3.